Okay, we talked about the data sources that criminologists use to determine and review crime trends and crime patterns. So let's look at those a little bit more extensively. According to the UCR, crime rates were gradually increasing between 1930s and the 1960s. In the 1960s, the crime rate itself grew significantly. The 1980s saw a continued increase in crime, specifically robbery, motor vehicle thefts, and homicide. And then in 1991, that's where the crime rate peaked, where it was reported 15 million crimes were reported in one year. Remember, we're looking at the UCR. We're only seeing crimes that are reported. And then after that, after 1991, the crime rate started to decrease. With in 2015, the total reported crimes was 9.2 million. And this is despite the fact that we had a huge increase in the U.S. population, too. So we're showing a significant decrease. Violent crimes were dropping. However, there was a slight uptick in 2015-2016 with 10% increase in reported murders. But property crimes, theft, and arson, those have been decreasing. Trends in victimization. That also has decreased over the last 30 years. Since 1993, the rate of violent victimization has declined 80%. The rate of serious violent crime against youths, and youths that's between the age of 12 and 17, has decreased. So despite the media hitting us with crime is out of control everywhere we turn, it is not. It's not. Actually, it's not more dangerous now than any other time in the U.S. The 19th century crime rate was way much higher. So, on the decline. So let's talk about specific explanations to trends. Actually, I'm not going to go in huge detail here because the second part of this week's assignment is going to include you exploring factors that cause crime rates to rise and fall. And there's 3 policy and issues in criminology that are in the book, some case studies. I'm going to have you pick one and analyze it, but you can see that more specifically in the assignments on Moodle. So I just want to kind of touch and do an overview on some of these factors. All right, explaining some trends and some factors. Age structure, right? There's a uptick in crime when we have a younger society. We'll talk a little bit more about age in a moment, but the structure. If we have a younger society, then the crime rate tends to uptick a little bit. Immigration. This is one of the issues in one of those assignments with regards to a discussion on immigration. But immigrants are less prone to crime, despite what the media and the president is telling us. The economy and jobs, unemployment. There's actually no correlation between a rise in crime when unemployment is up. However, criminals are generally underemployed, but it's not because of the economic conditions. Abortion, when it was legalized in the 70s, the crime rate dropped. Gun availability. This is there's no hard concrete evidence here, the relationship between guns and crime, but there's 2 views. There's no concrete evidence. Like I said, you take away the guns, it restricts the ability to defend, and the other side is there's too many guns in population, it increases violent crimes. There's no hard, fast information in that area it's being studied. It's not on my list, but mental health treatment availability should be on this list. And this comes into play, or we hear about it, when we see a mass shooting, right? On TV, mental health issues. Will it decrease crime? It's yet to be seen. But the need is certainly available. Gangs. There's been an uptick in teenage gangs, and actually teenage gangs are responsible for a large portion of the violent crimes. Drug use. There is proof that drug use results in an uptick in violence. The internet/media, which is in the top of my next slide here, does it have an effect on crime trends? Does being exposed to violence on TV and in the internet have any effect on crime? Hard to say. There are a lot of studies with regards to violence seen on media. It certainly has an effect on young children. They're very impressionable, and that there's a lot of research in that area. Medical technology affecting crime rate trends. We have a lot more advanced technology, saves more lives, maybe less murders. We're saving more lives. Justice policy, or let's put it under law enforcement and incarceration. We can call it justice policy. You add more law enforcement. Is that affecting it? A lot more arrests. There's a lot more law enforcement out there. We now have Homeland Security and Border Patrol. We didn't have that pre 9/11, 2001. Harsher penalties on crimes, more mandatory sentences, jail sentences for more serious crimes. Does that have an effect on the crime rate? Less people less likely to commit crimes. So there's certainly a slew of factors. Choose one of those passages in the book to explore these factors a little further. So what does the future hold with regards to crime trends? It's going down. We already talked about it peaked in 1991. It's difficult to kind of predict the future. I mentioned there was an uptick in murder in 2015, 2016, but it's hard to tell whether that will continue. A lot of things factor that. Consider the last 6 months in this country. No one could have predicted that coming. Will that have an effect on crime trends? Will soon to be seen. Limited economic opportunities affecting crime. Our country's businesses are outsourcing jobs. It's hard to find good paying jobs. We're still fighting low minimum wage in this country as cost of living increases. You got to consider, the country's current state of affairs. How about an increase in elementary school age children? We have more children. May lead to future increase in crime as they grow up. Age certainly has an effect on the crime rate. As I just mentioned, a younger society, we see an uptick. The rise but we also have a lot of folks who are living longer, and senior citizens tend to not fall in the category of those who commit crimes. We'll talk more about that with the patterns. We discuss crime patterns coming up here. So it's hard to tell where we're going to go with the future. Gang membership increases. We have an increase in gangs. As I said, violent. They tend to commit most of the serious violent crimes. Drug use is on the rise. The evidence is clear that drug use is on the rise, and that the use of drugs causes an uptick in crime. Technology advances, creates new criminal opportunities, also requires us to consider new classes of crimes. Before the internet, we didn't have any cyber type laws. Those things had to be created. So as we move forward, there might be a requirement to create more crimes, more laws, and then hence an increase in the crime rate. Let's talk about some crime patterns. What do experts do with their crime data? They look at patterns. They try to decipher if there's any patterns that appear in the crime rate, and this helps gain some insight into the nature of the crime. So they examine traits and patterns that influence crime rate, and one of those is the ecological patterns. Place, time, season, climate in rural, suburban areas has a lower crime rate than urban. Why? Overcrowding, poverty's higher, drug use is higher, social inequalities, racial conflict, they all create a role in crime. But even in the larger cities, big urban areas, it's not all the one city. It could be subjected to just specific areas or specific points in the city. Might be limited to a certain block or a certain neighborhood. They in turn have their own ecological factors, right? You might have a housing project that has more crime in it than the 1-2 blocks over. Seasons play a role. Summer has higher crime rate than other seasons. Why? Because more people are outside. Maybe more property crimes are more vulnerable. Actually, most crimes happen in public places. So people are out, school's out. As we said, the young folks tend to commit more crimes. Temperatures are too hot, so it means everyone's like a little bit more on edge. You're a little bit more cranky when you're hot. Crimes are more likely to happen at night than in the day. In the daytime, that's what the crime patterns show. Probably because there's not, number one, if they happen in public and they happen at night, there's probably not a lot of people out. It's hard to see at night. It's not in broad daylight. Regions are affected. The West and the South have higher crime rates than the Midwest and New England. Why do you think that is? Differences in economics, some claim, is the result. Or sometimes cultural values play a role of, the individuals that live in those regions of the country. Co-offending and crime. Crime tends to happen in groups, especially if we're talking about adolescents. But when they do, they're actually more likely to get caught. And I think the thinking behind the co-defending is there's safety in numbers. You go together with a group, but the research has shown that, and also if you go with a group, you think you can get more. If it's a theft crime, you can get more out of it. There's more of us. But actually, the research says that is not true. It actually results in less property being taken per offender, and it's more likely to be caught than if it's just one person. Usually, when there's more people involved, somebody's more likely to talk about it, right? And then word spreads, and somebody turns somebody in. There's gender patterns that have come out of the crime data. Males have a higher rate than female to committing crimes, especially if we're talking about violent crimes. Why would that be? Some of the reasons are they're stronger, so they're able to commit those crimes better. The hormonal differences make men more aggressive than women. Females, are We're socialized differently. We're socialized to be less aggressive and strongly discouraged to engage in that kind of behavior or any anti-behavior. Women have better verbal skills and tend to use those to diffuse conflict versus using physical. And growing up, males are granted greater personal freedom, and hence they have more opportunity to commit crimes than women who were faced with more parental controls. So all of those things play a role with regards to gender, but it's getting fairly close. It's not a huge gap between it. More women are committing crimes than men. It's becoming more equal. The other item affecting crime patterns, showing patterns, is racial patterns, and this is a more complex issue. The research or the data shows that minority groups are involved in a disproportionate share of criminal activity. From the statistics that are reporting from all of those sources, the 4 primary sources, including self-reporting. So taking away some of the statistics, African American males have been arrested 30% more than white males, 22%. And this is just so we get this number clear, this has been arrested once. This is being arrested once before the age of 18. African American males have been arrested 30% more than the white males, who it's 22%. And that number is 50% by the age of 23 versus white males, 38%. Obviously, the difference may be the function of practices, racial practices, racism practices within the criminal justice system, which is made up of the cops, the courts, and corrections. The treatment of African Americans by law enforcement has become a significant national concern. We are all seeing that at the moment under the current country's state of affairs. But history has shown, racial profiling has occurred in law enforcement. That is, and if you're not familiar with racial profiling in the general sense, it's law enforcement stopping and searching minorities, African Americans. And it's not just law enforcement. Minorities are more likely to be detained and incarcerated, as well as subjected to longer sentences, even for minor crimes. And that's the court system, the cops, the courts. And there's been 2 theories behind this. These are theories. The racial threat hypothesis, as the size of the African American population increases, the perceived threat to the white population increases, resulting in a greater amount of social control, i.e. by the criminal justice system that's imposed on African Americans. The theory, as explained in the book, is that white residents in a neighborhood overestimate the proportion of minorities living in the neighborhood, which leads to a false perception of disorder. Hence, they complain, so police become aggressive, or they aggressively patrol, and they search and they arrest for little things, little minor things, and then this gives rise to a higher minority crime rate. That's one theory. The other theory is the structural racism theory. And this theory is based on the racial discrimination that has spread through or has been present in American society for the last 100+ years. And this has resulted in economic and social disparity, and as a result, minorities face social isolation and economic deprivation more so than whites, and because of these disparities, they're involved in more crime activity. So those are the theories behind that. So racial crime patterns, use of firearms. According to the NCVS, firearms are typically involved in more than, close to 300,000 non-fatal victimizations each year. About 70% of murders involve a firearm. This is a hot button topic, right? Guns, gun control itself. Argument one: control guns, keep them off the street, and it prevents crime. Argument two: we need guns to protect ourselves from crimes. Those are two logical arguments. And then there's point three, which there's some backing on the research, is that guns are rarely used by victims to prevent crime. So the argument is we need guns to protect ourselves from crime. Guns are rarely used by the victim to prevent crime. Regarding new guns and purchases of guns, that's research shows that's a non-issue because the crimes involving guns were mostly used by old guns or guns that changed hands over time versus somebody walking into the store and buying a gun and then using it to commit a crime. So, guns, gun control. Social class patterns and unemployment. Kind of talked about this a little earlier, talking about trends. Where unemployment rates are higher, there's crime is higher, and I don't mean unemployment as economics in this particular example. I'm talking about where people are living in poverty and there's social discord happening. There's unemployment, right? Unemployment rates are higher. Reason behind it: lack in economic and social opportunities strain these residents, so then they in turn commit crimes. They're from broken families, so there's no youth supervision. There's no ability to exert any social control. Sometimes police aren't even focused on these areas, or they're not devoting any resources. So those tend to play a role, and folks will, when they're subject to those things, folks will tend to commit crimes that are goal-oriented. The instrumental crimes, the goal is to provide desired goods and services they can't get through other means, like food, like stealing food or cars. Other crimes, expressive crimes, some folks will engage in expressive crimes where they're just acting out due to their frustration for the unfair and unjust society, so they act out and they commit assault crimes or rape crimes. Unemployment, this is the economic component of employment that I alluded to earlier. And the research conflicts. It would seem to be logical that the higher the unemployment rate economically in the country, the higher the unemployment rate would lead to a higher crime rate. But the research shows that the opposite is true. And what is shown is two factors show that the crime peaks higher during high employment and falls when people are out of work. And the suggestion seems to be that when people are employed, they're out and about. They go out, they go to bars, they spend money, they go out to dinner, and remember, most crimes happen in public. You're more susceptible being subject to a crime. When unemployed, people are home. They're not spending as much. They're not going out as much. They're home with their children. They might be selling any of their belongings of value, so nobody's trying to steal them. in order to make money. So yeah, it's just the opposite with unemployment rate. They actually call that the weak association, that what I had just explained. Age and crime. Younger people commit crimes. The peak is 16 years old for property crimes and 18 for violent crimes. Elderly people don't commit crimes. Males 65 and older tend to commit drinking while intoxicated, DWI, crimes, and the older females are more likely to be shoplifters, are involved in petty theft. Why young people? Why a high crime rate for young people? They're the risk takers, right? Tend to be more riskier. They're immature. They limit financial resources. They also have the energy and physical strength and skill to pull it off. Also, the juvenile justice system isn't as harsh as our adult criminal system. So that plays a role in their decision making. They're also given more privileges, and they have less supervision and responsibilities. As an adult has more responsibilities that they have to take care of. Also, there's been some research that the biology makeup, the levels of hormones that affect behavior, a little higher in young people than in lower. And the crime peaks at adolescence and declines thereafter. So they young folks most of the time age out of their crime. And it's also just a factor of our human makeup and our natural history of our human cycle. So the desire that fuels criminal activity tends to subside. And these are research. This is what the criminologists have found from reading the data and what the patterns turn out relative to age. So that is crime trends and patterns. There's an assignment that goes along with this, like I mentioned. Make sure you look at it in Moodle. And the last topic for this chapter is chronic offenders, and we'll cover that next.